Welcome back to the Printed Prop Shop. I'm Michael. Today we've got Moon Knight. This is an alternative mask. As you can clearly see, it's not the one that's all wrapped up. The model is from Nico Industries. So hit up his Patreon, hit up his webpage, nicoindustries.com, I believe. I'll link it below. It's an excellent file. It came out beautifully. It's in two parts. The little back part clips on. So without further ado, here's how I did it. So to start with, we're using Armor Smith here. I have mentioned Armor Smith before, I believe with the Rocketeer. And again, I'll reiterate, if you're doing any kind of cosplay or you're making helmets or any kind of body parts, this program is well worth the investment, and they didn't pay me anything to say that. I'm just saying it because it is. I want to say it runs around $30, and it will pay for itself in the fact of not having to do all of your manual measurements every time. So I've already got my head measured in here. Unfortunately, my body is not, because I'm just not that lean, and I haven't done any really body parts yet. But I've gone and attached the helmet to my head. I've made some minor adjustments that I kind of thought where it should be, but I overshot it. As you can tell, it's still rather large on my head. So what I'm doing is just adjusting the scaling down in the bottom left hand corner there. I've taken off uniform scaling, and then fitting it in place, I've adjusted the opacity as well so you can see through the helmet itself to see how it's fitting. And right about there is probably pretty good as far as the height and the width from front to back. Still have some adjustments to do on from left to right, just because I want to make sure that it clears my ears. And you can see here in a moment when I've gone and adjusted it, but it's all the minor adjustments that you make in here that will make such a better fit. Again, too, I'm leaving space for foam, because I don't want that helmet just resting on my head. If I did that, I would have to put in probably a really thin piece of padding, which I could do, but I have that cheap foam, so that's what I'm going to use, and make it about 1 inch thick. So when it compresses, it's down to at least half an inch when it's compressed on my head. But I go and make it so that my ears will fit in there. Now, if you have larger ears, of course, you would want to measure it out further. In this program, when you measure it from your ear tips, furthest extent of your head, your ear tips. But here I've gone and placed the back on there, because this model is 2 pieces. And honestly, if you just go and match up your scaling points from the front of the helmet, everything should fit just fine, and it did. I didn't have any issues with lining up. Everything was perfect, and I just matched the scaling. So as long as you keep to those points, you shouldn't have any problems. And then after this, I can just export the model into another STL file, and it's already sized for me. Okay, now on to Slicer. The whole reason I'm cutting it up is, for one, it's already cut into 2 pieces. For two, I've always had failures when I try to go and print one piece, even a large piece, so I'm always going to cut it up and assemble it together. But I do make my cuts in places that are easily put back together. So if you notice, I'll make it right underneath the nose. I never want to put a seam on a crest, because then it's just harder to go and mold into crest again. So I'll put it a little further down at an angle, and I've never had any problems with seams if I've ever done that. So I've got one of the models here in Cura. If you notice, it's got that little lip on there. That actually didn't print out. I think it's just a problem with the transition from the STL to Slicer, the Slicer program back into Cura. But it didn't cause any problems, and if you look at the final print for the preview, It's not sitting there, and it wasn't, again, printed at all. It didn't have any problems with the print coming out as far as that goes. And I used minimal support as usual, which I didn't really need too much. So I've got my pieces all printed out here. It did have a texture that printed out when Nico modeled it, I think. It had already had some texture, but I'm not going to use that texture. It did have a little bit of stringing from the print, and that's just my printer, the way it prints, and minimal supports. You're going to get that. So I just went and clipped them off, and then it had some support structure around the eyes and along the side for the texture. I'm not sure why that printed out like that, but it did. It wasn't that hard to get off, and just used some clippers to get it. But I did some sanding as well, just on the seams, and to do some of that texture on top that may have had any kind of nubs on it. I wanted the pieces to fit together precisely so that I didn't have any problems with them matching up with each other. So here I've added some construction adhesive. You can pick this up at any kind of hardware store or Walmart. I like to put it on before I actually do any kind of plastic welding. It just gives that little extra security to me, so that if the parts should happen to pull apart, it's got that kind of secondary defense. One thing I will tell you is, if you're putting this on and then you're going to plastic weld, make sure that you are wearing a mask. I know that sometimes you'll see me without it, but make sure you have a mask or a fan blowing. For instance, here I have an actual fan underneath the table there off to the right, blowing out the window, drawing those fumes away from me. And as you can tell, the pieces fit up just fine together. They didn't have any kind of issues. They lined up just fine. You can't even see the seam on the finished model at all. You wouldn't even know that this piece was actually printed in 4 pieces. And then here I'm taking that wood burner that I commonly use and just taking along the inside seam. I did do more on the inside seam than the outside seam, and that was just because this was going to be a model that, if you had any problems with the outside, it was going to be noticeable as far as plastic welding or any kind of plastic that kind of melted up, that I wouldn't be able to get sanded down as smooth as I wanted to. And I didn't really want to use too much filler on the outside of it, so that was why I did more on the inside. And then anywhere that maybe I had supports, or maybe I didn't use supports and the plastic kind of strung, I took that wood burner and just smoothed it out on the inside. I know it's not going to be seen, but again, I didn't want it to be roughing up against my face, or especially my chin and that chin area. So, and again too, just hold this wood burner, or you can use a soldering iron, just hold it over the top, and it'll actually do more of a baking process as opposed to really digging up that plastic. I like for it to kind of melt and fall. And as we move to the outside, like I said, I didn't do a whole lot on the outside. I was doing more of that baking method and letting it just melt on its own, rather than really placing it directly on it. I was more hovering over the top of it, as you can kind of see here. And hey, if you look, you can hardly see a seam even after I've melted it together. That seam that you're seeing is actually the construction adhesive kind of splurging out the sides. Now, typically you'll see me use fiberglass resin on the outside, but for this model, again, I didn't want to lose detail on the outside as far as the seam goes running up the front, and the moon on the top. I didn't want to lose those details that were in the model already. So what I'm doing here is just adding extra support for the inside of it. And it honestly, I could probably do this with every single model and have the structural integrity that I'm looking for. But and a lot of times too, I'll do inside and outside. But for this particular model, I just did the inside to have some stability and reassurance for myself that it's not going to fall apart on me. Again, too, it's just a secondary kind of protection that will make sure that you won't have any issues. Now, this is something I haven't showed yet, but as far as wood filler goes, a lot of times if you're not wanting a bulky amount on the outside, and again, too, my wood filler was drying up a little bit. What you can do is put it on the model and then just dip your fingers in water, and it'll really smooth it out. And honestly, I use this a good amount. You've seen some of my other videos. I didn't do it so much in there because I knew I was just going to sand as much as possible. But if you're looking for less sanding and a smoother surface to sand with, to where you won't have to do so much work, this method works out great. And the sanding on it is actually a little bit easier. Again, too, with those seams that I had, I didn't want to lose detail, so that was why I was thinning this wood filler out. And it's just that tub wood filler that you see me using constantly, just plastic wood, Walmart, Lowe's, any kind of hardware store or big box store. You can usually find it in multi-purpose store. But again, too, just go and put on a good amount, put your fingers in some water and thin it out, and just smooth it out as much as possible. And then when you go to sand it, it'll sand relatively easy. And again, too, it's actually pretty decent if you're going over a seam or a connection point like I have at the top there, to where you can just take, a file and take it right over top and it'll come right off, or you could even use a blade. So now that my wood filler is all dry, I'm just going over it with some sandpaper. Using, it's fairly rough. It's a 320. And just knocking it off, taking it down to the actual textured surface, since I wasn't going to be able to use the actual molded textured surface. That was what I wanted to smooth out as much as possible. And again, too, if you notice, it's sanding relatively easy with that thinned out wood filler, and especially with me going over a seam right there for the actual connection point for the pieces. It was filling in just fine and didn't have any issues. So I did throw on a coat of Plastidip. Now, I didn't end up using the Plastidip for the finished texture on the outside. I actually went with a different method that I'll show you later on. But the upside was that I did use Plastidip just in case. Now, the nice thing I found about Plastidip is if it doesn't work out on you, you can just peel it off. And it comes off relatively easy. It may take some of your wood filler with it, but for the most part, at least you don't have to start all over with another print or anything like that. And here, I was attempting to use the naphtha to smooth it out like I had in the past with some other different models. But it just wasn't what I was looking for as far as an outside texture. I wanted more of a mask texture that looked more rubber, and it just wasn't working out. And since that wasn't working out, I actually tried to use a sponge, and that was working a little bit for texturing. I would spray some Plastidip into a cup, get a good amount in there, and then use this sponge, and it was coming out okay. I mean, if you wanted to use this technique, that's the only reason I'm showing it to you right now, is because it wasn't too bad. With a little bit more work, or maybe if you were to go and maybe just use Mod Podge or something like that instead with a sponge, I think that you would probably get a pretty good texture. But for me, this wasn't what I was looking for with this. So I actually started looking for other alternatives, and that's when I came across the truck bed liner from Andrew. And I saw his completed model, and I said, this is probably what's going to work best for me. So a good friend of mine, Andrew Fry, I'll call him out, Andrew Fry, from one of my Facebook groups, he actually made a Daredevil helmet. And he was looking around for things that would make his helmet look more like rubber and have kind of a texture on it. So I hit him up and asked him what he used, because his model looked really great. And he said truck bed liner. So I started looking around at truck bed liner and found out that it does give a texture when it's done. However, there are a little bit of concerns with it. It will really harden. So once you put it on, it's gonna stay. Number two is, if you don't put it on in light coats, it's gonna run on you, run really bad, worse than Plastidip can run on you. Which I did test out on my little tub right there, and it does run. So light coats. Total, I put on about probably 3 or 4 coats on this guy. And as soon as it started hardening, I looked at it, and it was exactly the texture I was looking for to go with it. And I'll link it below. You can find truck bed liner in most automotive stores. I couldn't find it at Lowe's, but they said they did carry it online, so that could be an alternative as well. Something I did want to say, though, is that it was a good thing that I had the Plastidip on there, because some of it did run on the back plate that connects, and I was able just to peel that right off. So I wanted to be able to have the back plate just kind of clip on with magnets. So what I did is I had some of these little shelf holders. If you see them, they're little pegs that fit into your shelving cabinet, the really cheap shelving cabinets, let me rephrase that you pick up at like Walmart or something like that, the particle board ones. And I had lost some in my move for one of my cabinets. So I picked these up on Amazon. I want to say there was about 50 of them in this little bag for $4 or $5. And they're metal, so I thought it would probably work out fairly well with magnets to be able to clip on, and it actually did. These I actually took and put a little construction adhesive under them just to hold them in place. Then I took my 3D pen, which if you don't have a 3D printer pen, I wouldn't go crazy on them. You can find them on Amazon for $25, $30, relatively cheap, and it works just fine. What I've found when I've tried several different 3D printer pens, they all print pretty much the same. It's the speed variation that you want to watch. Just like your regular printer, you don't want it to feed out too fast. But it heats up to, I want to say it was 260 degrees Celsius is what it was on this particular one. I got it a long time ago. But if you were to do something like this, it actually holds it in place and it bonds to that other PLA that you've already printed. So it's really handy. So like most of my models, I had already put on my primer coat. I just didn't catch that. But it was a regular primer gray. And then I went over it with this matte glacier gray that is a spray enamel. And this actually was primer as well. It had primer and paint in it. And it was a matte covering, so it worked out fairly well. It just wasn't the exact color I was going for. But quite honestly, if you were making this, you could just go and throw on this matte glacier gray and probably get the color you're looking for. I just wanted it to have a little bit more variation. So that was what I ended up going with as far as airbrushing. And with the airbrushing, I ended up going with, it was a matte white with an aluminum gunmetal, just to darken it up a little bit. And as you can see in the next step, it came out fairly well. So to start, I wanted to highlight that seam to make sure that it didn't get lost in all of the different paint. Now it's still going to be white, but if I go over it fairly light, it'll just give more of an expression to it. And if you notice in the finished model, you can still make out that seam, you can make out the moon. The eyes have a little bit of black to them. But yeah, that was what I was going for, and it actually came out fairly well as well. And it's just my regular matte black that I typically use for any kind of detailing like that. Now, like I said, I used a matte white with aluminum gunmetal, and the ratio was about 70% white to 30% gunmetal. And I didn't go over it completely. I kind of variated my sprays so that some of the glacier gray would come through and some of that white would appear. And my inspiration was basically the character's name is Moon Knight. So if you're looking at the moon on a full moon night, you see the white, but you also see the variations of the grays from the impact craters. So that was what I was going for. And over any of the black, I just went fairly light over the black lines, black paint rather, so that would still appear through and be more defined, more like an impact crater on the moon. So I wanted to start doing these lenses to go in here. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, you can't see out of them, but it was the only really thing I had on hand that I could really work with. And this was just thin, clear styrene that I just took and sanded up a little bit to rough up so that it would be more of a fogged eye as opposed to just a regular lens with some lights behind it. And maybe later on I'll go and change them out for some actual lenses that light up, but for right now it's perfectly fine for me. Now if I go to a con or something like that and I'm gonna wear this, then yeah, I would need to change them out because I wouldn't be able to walk around and I wouldn't be able to see anything, but they work just fine. Now I took my heat gun, and like I said, this is relatively thin, clear styrene. So it didn't require too much heat. If you're using a heat gun, it'd be a low setting. And just molded them a little bit so they'd fit in place better. I didn't go crazy with the molding on it. Now these strip LED lights, they're battery powered. I had them sitting around for sign projects that I was working with for a while. And I had some left over, and they're not crazy bright. But if you do cut them, they won't work, and without soldering them back. And I didn't really want to go through that, so I just used the whole strip. I did 4 lights to an eye, and simply just went through them. The nice thing is it had copper wire that would stay in place for the most part while the hot glue dried. But as you can see, I put the little battery box down towards the chin, out of sight, but still where I could just reach up with one little finger and turn it on or off. And then the excess wire I just taped up with some regular masking tape that I had on hand. It's going to be on the inside. I didn't really care too much who saw it or anything like that. So I just masked it up and then hot glued it into place. Worked out perfectly fine. These little guys you can pick up. I picked them up in bulk on Amazon. I want to say I got like 10 or 20 of them for $10. And they're relatively bright. They're not anything crazy. I didn't really want to go and wire up my own circuit. I did have some LEDs to be able to do it, but I just didn't feel like doing it as far as time constraint. This was a cheap method to work out that did the same thing I needed it to do. And it's just a couple of watch batteries. Didn't have to worry about adding resistors or anything like that.
So guys, that's how I did it. As you can tell, it fits. The audio is probably a little bland because it's in a helmet right now. But I did go and mold it in Armorsmith, as you saw. It fits just fine. The eyes are lit up. Unfortunately, you can't see through the eyes, so I'm gonna have to work that out. But the nice thing is they're just hot glued in, so it doesn't really matter. But I can stand here all day and look at the camera and not see anything, but it fits pretty nice. Hey, this has been Michael. Thank you for watching the Printed Prop Shop and have a great day.